The fight for Aleppo ramps up. Could this be the turning point in the Syrian war? We speak to a founding member of the opposition. Also on today's program, is free trade a myth? Why the global economy's supposed savior can come with serious strings attached. And in Picture This, the grand finale. Almost a month of pro-democracy demonstrations culminates in Turkey. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. It's Syria's largest city, and now it could seal the country's fate. Aleppo has been under fire for months now, with the Syrian regime and rebels going head-to-head to claim the key area once and for all. There's been a brief pause in fighting to let in humanitarian assistance, but soon the battle will begin again, and it could be in its final stages, becoming a significant turning point in the 5-year war. If the regime ends up losing Aleppo, it could revive international efforts to oust Bashar al-Assad, a diluted idea in recent months following Russian intervention in the conflict. Now, today's newsmaker is Aleppo, as we ask, how will the outcome in this flashpoint city alter the war in Syria?
It's a city divided between the Syrian regime and rebel forces at war. Their battle for control has killed thousands of people and left many more needing emergency aid. But neither side has been able to claim victory. Government forces surrounded Aleppo's city center, occupied by rebels, a month ago. But this week, rebels breached the siege in the southwest. They say it's just the beginning. The Army of Conquest rebels have announced plans for a new offensive to take over all of Aleppo. It could be a decisive phase in the 4-year battle for the strategically important city. Aleppo was Syria's cultural capital, a treasure trove of ancient history now destroyed. But it's still home to nearly 300,000 Syrians trapped in the center. And is also an industrial hub with a supply line to forces on either side of the city. Aleppo would be a strategic win, but if this battle continues, life here will get much worse. There have been new reports of chlorine gas and barrel bomb attacks in Aleppo, hitting critical infrastructure and supplies. The UN says more than 2 million citizens of Aleppo are without water, and hospitals have come under constant fire. Russia, which backs the Syrian regime, has proposed daily 3-hour ceasefires to allow aid into the city, but the UN says that's not enough.
You need 2 lanes and you need to have about 48 hours to get sufficient trucks in.
There are enormous resources ready and humanitarian workers willing to take the risk to go into these zones if they get the permission. And they are not at the moment.
In spite of the ceasefire proposal, Aleppo is bracing for more violence and what could be a final showdown to take over the city and a possible turning point in the war. Sandra Gottman, The Newsmakers.
Well, Yaser Tabbara joins me now here in the studio. He is a founding member of the Syrian National Council and also co-founder of the Syrian Forum. Yaser, thanks so much for joining us. You've said what is happening now in Syria, in Aleppo, actually represents a new strategy entirely, and this will be a game changer. Why?
Well, for the first time ever, we saw that the rebel factions all across the spectrum have decided to just put their hands together and break this really choking siege on over 300,000 civilians that have been basically threatened with extermination by the Syrian regime, empowered by the Russian Air Force and other militias. This is a strategy that we saw being implemented by the regime in Homs in 2014, and it's a strategy that we continue to see in smaller areas like Daraya and the suburbs of Damascus and Madaya and other places where they focus on basically a choking siege, starving people almost to death, and then forcing the rebels to basically leave arms, and then they can engage in the demographic changes that they have been doing in these types of areas.
Right, but we've seen a show of unity among these rebel groups surrounding a common enemy. But the truth is, these rebel groups often have very little in common.
That's very true.
So then what happens? Will they descend into civil war if they do succeed in breaking the regime siege of Aleppo?
And this is an extremely important point. The fact that the world has, in no vague terms, decided to abandon these 300,000 civilians with the armed opposition and the resistance movement that has been protecting them, or at least trying to protect them for years, and basically made statements about the siege, nothing more, nothing less. This forced a lot of the armed opposition that isn't classically aligned with some of the more extreme groups to actually put their hands together in one front and to break the siege. And that's exactly what happened. Now, what's gonna happen next is still to be seen. But bottom line is that 300,000 civilians do not face the same threat anymore.
But yeah, so how is the world supposed to intervene? I mean, we've heard the UN say over and over again that the only solution here is a political solution, because these factions in Syria are just too divided. Now, you even came to the table at one point, your group, to negotiate and then backed out because you said you'd refuse to negotiate until Bashar al-Assad stepped down. That's not going to happen. If everyone is going to be that stubborn, how is a political solution supposed to be reached?
Well, actually, there's a factual inaccuracy with what just was stated. The Syrian National Coalition did not step down or back down because they refused to engage in negotiations until Bashar steps down. That is not accurate. What we asked for, what they asked for at the time, repeatedly, is a number of confidence-building measures that are reinforced by the international community, such as releasing thousands and tens of thousands of detainees that are facing imminent death, such as lifting the siege on areas that have been starved to death, such as stopping the air raids and air bombardment campaigns that have been targeting hospitals, mosques, marketplaces, civil defense places, civilian populated areas. These are things that continued to happen through every single round of the negotiations. The international community did not intervene. Russia, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, basically was directly complicit with this criminality, and as such, there was no choice but for this group to say that we have to basically suspend participation in negotiations until some of these just minimum threshold steps of confidence-building measures are there.
Why are you no longer involved in negotiations?
The group basically has formed into a bigger group, which is basically the commission, the negotiations commission, which is actually in Riyadh, based in Riyadh, and still engages in Geneva, and is still engaged in second track and third track diplomacy. Again, I think the international community, the major brokers of the Syrian file right now, the international brokers are not ready to sit down at the table and basically make serious concessions happen, such as the immediate halt of air bombardments. Right now, there's a fundamental truth about what's happening in Syria. The only groups that control the air, which is the main source of death and mayhem all across Syria, are the Syrian Air Force and the Russian Air Force. To a smaller extent, the coalition Air Force as well, but these are very controlled areas that they target, including ISIS and Raqqa and other places. This is the main source of the mayhem and the destruction. Until that is put under control, until that stops, I don't think anybody wants to move forward with any sort of negotiations because it's pointless.
Okay, but you still seem optimistic about what is happening in Aleppo right now. You've said it's a game changer. Can you give us some kind of time scale? If this opposition battle succeeds, if Aleppo is reclaimed, when will we see real change in Syria?
I think that will send a very strong signal to the Assad regime and to its cohorts and its supporters, mainly Russia, that the local resistance forces the national resistance forces are coming together, and they can make a difference. It's not about just international brokers basically pulling the strings on what's happening on the ground in Syria. And I think once that message is delivered clearly, that will force some of these players to sit down at the table and start reconsidering whether they want a real political solution, which is something that we've been calling for since the Geneva Communique back in 2012, which basically calls for a transitional government body that will transit the government or the country into a more peaceful, more stable, more democratic process and context. And I think hopefully, this is obviously without, I'm cautiously optimistic about this whole process, such as the majority, I would say, of the political opposition and some of the armed opposition, because, again, they have been forced to put their hands with groups that they do not usually put their hands with. But hopefully that will force, the file to move forward somehow. Okay. And once it moves forward, we believe that could produce some change on the other side.
Do you think the civilian population can hold out much longer? And what do they ultimately want for Aleppo?
I just hung up the phone with some of my contacts on the ground in Aleppo. There's an incredible high spirit in terms of what the armed national resistance were able to do in the past week. There is also hope and some supplies, actually medical supplies and some basic foods have been able to enter Aleppo surprisingly through other local organizations in other cities in Syria that are under duress, different types of duress as well, and not through international organizations, unfortunately. But even under these terrible conditions, even under the aerial bombardment, people are in high spirits and they're waiting for the balance of power to shift in order for them to participate in basically forcing a real political solution and not something that is imposed on them by rehabilitating the regime of Bashar al-Assad or something to that extent.
Okay, Yaser Tabbara, unfortunately we're out of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Still to come on the Newsmakers, the cost of free trade. We explore why the economic model is so contentious. And in Picture This, power to the people. Turkish citizens give a final show of support for their democracy. Well, it's been called the gold standard for a thriving global economy. Supporters of free trade have long hailed it as the antidote to failing financial conditions across the world. A principle that liberates markets and knows no bounds. But its critics say it's doing the opposite, crippling local economies, breeding greed, and putting businesses before people. And anyways, is anything ever really for free? Yvette McCullough takes a look.
An open global market, increased wealth and living standards. That's the promise of the free trade model, championed by leaders such as former UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and US President Ronald Reagan. Since the 1990s, more than 200 free trade agreements have been signed worldwide, countries agreeing to lift trade barriers, regulations and restrictions. It has been hailed as the best way to grow the global economy. But according to its opponents, free trade has done just the opposite. For fans of free trade, it's been a critical factor in global poverty reduction. In 1981, 44.3% of the world was below the poverty line, living on less than $1.90 a day. In 2012, that figure dropped to 12.7%. The success of free trade lies in the idea of comparative advantage, countries prospering by concentrating on what they produce best. It's also argued that an open market leads to more competition and innovation, and therefore more jobs. But for many, free trade is focused on the well-being of businesses, not people, actually reducing jobs as local companies are undercut by products made more cheaply and with lower labour standards in other countries. And they say developing economies, that free trade is meant to help the most, have actually been the biggest losers, only creating wealth for a few and also forcing local industries to die out if they can't compete internationally. We are on the cusp of seeing the biggest free trade deal in history, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, bringing together 12 countries that make up around 40% of the world's economy. But opposition to the TPP has been loud and widespread, with concern it will only empower corporations, erode democracy and stifle competition. The backlash to this and other forms of free trade has been a major theme of the US presidential election, with Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders vehemently opposing it early on.
I believe it continues a trend of horrendous trade policies which have cost us millions of decent-paying jobs.
America has lost nearly 1/3 of its manufacturing jobs since 1997, following the enactment of disastrous trade deals.
And Hillary Clinton later following suit. While in Europe, scepticism of the EU and the single market is also building. For more than 30 years, free trade and liberal markets have been held up as the world economy's best hope. But have the benefits been oversold? And if it's not the best model for the world's financial future, what is? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now to discuss the pros and cons of free trade agreements are from Ankara, Murat Yulek. He's a professor of economics and the director of the Center for Industrial Policy and Development at Istanbul Commerce University. And from Palm Springs, California, Steve Quintanilla, a legal commentator and attorney with the California state government. Thanks both so much for joining us. Let me try and get a broad picture from both of you first. Have global free trade agreements improved the state of the world, or have they actually exacerbated levels of poverty and destroyed manufacturing, particularly in countries like the US, as the critics would say? Steve, let me start with you.
Well, first of all, I'd just like to state for the record that I am not an economist, I'm not a sociologist, nor am I a philosopher. I'm an attorney who represents cities here in California. So I am closely involved with a lot of the local residents in regards to this whole debate over free trade. I personally think from a global perspective, free trade has been wonderful for the world. It has promoted peace amongst the nations that have traded. And when we look at around the world and look at where there is conflict, we see that there is a lack of free trade in those areas. So I think free trade really promotes peace in the world, which is a very good thing from my perspective.
Okay, Murat?
Well, let me just also start by saying that I'm not an attorney, I'm an economist. What I have seen so far is with respect to all the positive aspects of free trade, there has been also costs, especially for the developing countries, but also even on the regional basis for countries like USA.
Would it be fair to say then, Murat, in your opinion, that free trade is more like a zero-sum game? The benefits don't necessarily outweigh the losses, but it's kind of sometimes win-win, sometimes lose-lose on both sides?
Let me give you one example that concerns US. In the US, there was a bill called the Farm Bill. I'm talking about 2003, 2004. There was a farm bill which supported American agricultural sector. And on the other hand, there was the West African states, for example, of Benin or Niger or Burkina Faso. In these countries, very poor countries, the livelihood of millions of people dependent on agricultural production such as cotton or some other local production. And when they entered into free trade, they could not really compete with the efficient and well-supported American agricultural products because the the subsidies in the U.S. not only caused the American agricultural, the farmers, to be in an advantageous situation, but also they depressed the world prices. And then there was a very negative poverty effect on those countries.
I do actually want to ask you something more specific about the United States, because this issue of free trade agreements has been a pillar in the campaigns, both on the Republican and Democratic sides. Both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump have vehemently rejected the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Donald Trump keeps talking about putting America first, bringing back these manufacturing jobs to the U.S. If he were to get his way, if his vision were enacted, what do you think the global economy would actually look like as a result? And what would putting America first mean?
I think it would be disastrous, not only for the world economy, but also for the United States. My concern about this debate over free trade is that I think that both sides, or all three sides, and include Bernie Sanders, is really a way of masking what our real issues are here in the United States. I think free trade is being used as a scapegoat for not being able to resolve immigration issues here in the United States. We're using free trade to turn certain groups, income groups, against one another. We're using free trade as an excuse for why we are losing manufacturing jobs. I think that the issue here in the United States is that we have to restructure our economy to accommodate this whole globalization of the marketplace.
Right.
And that means looking beyond free trade.
I'm curious from both of you about the idea of bringing those manufacturing jobs back, as Donald Trump would put it, because it seems that manufacturing jobs are actually just being phased out. More and more manufacturing has just been mechanized. The jobs are actually moving further and further into high-tech and intellectual property industries. So let me ask you, is there a way to actually bring these manufacturing jobs back with the kind of wages that would bring dignity, if I can put it that way, to some of the lower skilled workers? Murat.
Is it to me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes. Well, basically, this is a very interesting and actually story, but also it needs a lot of discussion. First, let me just give you one important information and statistics. United States of America today is the second largest manufacturer of the world, with about $2.5 trillion in manufacturing output. So when we are talking about, in the context of the US, all those, manufacturing employment lost, well, definitely there is a, losing of those employment to the developing countries such as East Asian countries. But as you have pointed out, most of the numbers that have, the reduced numbers of manufacturing came from technology. And this is what you have said a minute ago. Currently, this $2.5 trillion worth of manufacturing output in the US is made by less than 10 million workers. That makes American manufacturing worker one of the most efficient in the world. That's very interesting.
Okay.
Now, coming back, yeah.
I'm sorry, but we only have a few seconds left. I just wanted to get final words from Steve, if that's possible, on the same.
Oh, yeah, with respect to manufacturing, I think that in America, where our economy has evolved and we're evolving away from manufacturing, I think that one of the greatest products that we produce here in America is ingenuity and ideas. And that's one of the reasons why I think that we're at the forefront of high technology out of the Silicon Valley area. And I think that's our greatest export. And I think that in America, what we need to do is restructure our educational system to focus on high technology, to focus on intellectual products, because that's one of our greatest exports in this country, and I think that's the future of the world. I think countries that, countries where there's large labor populations, I think it's important for them to take on that role in the economy and help them develop, because as they develop, they create a consumer base for our products.
Okay, Steve Quintanilla and Murat Yulek.
I think that we should be moving away from manufacturing.
Okay, Steve Quintanilla and Murat Yulek, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Thank you both so much for joining us. In today's Picture This, thousands of people have been out on the streets of Turkey every night since an attempted coup nearly a month ago. But the pro-democracy rallies have finally drawn to a close. Let's take a look back. Today's newsmaker was Aleppo, as we asked, how will the outcome of the battle for Syria's largest city alter the ongoing war? The city is strategically important, home to key supply routes and hundreds of thousands of people. If the Syrian regime ends up losing Aleppo, experts say it could revive international efforts to oust Bashar al-Assad. A temporary ceasefire is currently in place to allow humanitarian aid into the area, but violence is expected to resume soon in what could be a turning point in the war and the very fight for Syria's future. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.